Hello, and a ho 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 to you all. This is the special Christmassy, though not necessarily Christmassy themed episode of the Gallimaufry, episode number 34. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Will, and I am joined today by my good friend, Jolly St. Nick. What have you got in your sack today, Jolly St. Nick?
And a fine Merry Christmas to you too. Well, I haven't actually had a time to look. Why don't you have a quick rummage and see what you can find?
Let's have a look. What have we got here? Here we go. We've got some unpaid gas bills. I don't think those should be in there.
Let's not give British Gas any reason to come after me.
What else have we got? We've got a can of Irish Moss. We've got Champion the One Horse Annual 1954.
These are all your best Christmas and birthday presents you've ever given me.
And we also have an absolutely cracking episode for you.
Yes, it's going to be filled with not really Christmas joy, but a lot of joy in general.
Yes.
It's a general joy.
This episode is about mass observation. Sadly, not ass observation as I initially thought. Bit of a disappointment there, Nick, I think.
Yes, I'm so sorry. With a name like mass observation, it does conjure to the mind something almost Orwellian or sort of slightly seedy at the same time.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking it was going to be something quite pervy.
But I'm surprised you don't remember it, because I made you dress up in a silly Edwardian costume to reenact a scene once for a short film I made years ago.
Oh, is that why you made me do that? All I remember is being invited to the beach and being told I had to dress up it as an Edwardian, and it turned up it was just me, you, my sister, and your mate who had a camera.
And thus the greatest porno was ever made.
Yes, but never mind. You don't need to watch that because we've pretty much covered it in this episode. And fortunately, my sister's not involved, or your strange friend.
Anyway, you're right. Let's actually tell people what mass observation is,
yes,
rather than our random musings from the past.
Yes. So moving on, what is mass observation? Shall I read my what is mass observation bit, or you're more knowledgeable? If you want to summarise it, you'll do a better job than me, won't you?
I've waited so long to hear you say those words. It's actually one of the first and largest investigations into the thoughts and feelings of the British public and British culture at the time. You know, it was a project set up in the late 1930s, which ran until more or less 1949, 1950 in essence, and essentially went to the people, real people like you and me. Well, maybe not you, and asked them what they thought about events, rather than simply sort of looking at the media. It was dubbed a new science of ourselves, so it asked people to keep diaries, record their dreams, and respond to questions on anything and everything. And I mean everything. So there was, from Shakespeare to, I don't know, shaking your spear in the bedroom, if you're into that sort of thing.
If that's what you want to call it, you call it that.
It's thin and pointy.
Was that a direct quote?
It's actually a review. Before we delve into the people that founded mass observation, this social history movement, as well as a project, we should probably just take a quick look at the era it was born in. So it was born effectively in 1937, which of course the 30s was a decade of tremendous turmoil, as I'm sure you're aware.
There was something going on around the end of that decade, wasn't there?
There was something going on all the way through it. It wasn't just at the end.
Yeah.
There are very many parallels between our last decade. And in fact, it's kind of dragging into this one as well. Britain had a succession of coalition governments managed by the Tories to try and manage a financial crisis that had struck at the end of the previous decade. There was a growing rise of fascism sweeping Europe. There were constant outbreaks of war across Europe and other places and the Far East. Workers constantly on strike and marching for food. And the king was obviously embroiled in a relationship controversy.
Yeah, not happy parallels.
Well, no, there is one that isn't really a parallel, but is quite a nice, happy thing, is that paperbacks became available and were taking off in popularity. So there is that.
I suppose you could maybe make correlation between that and the rise of the internet, maybe, as a way of...
Well, the internet rose like 30 years ago.
Yeah,
maybe TikTok. Is TikTok the new paperback?
Something. Maybe. What was it? I mean, paperback. What was it? Was it seen as something quite trashy at the time, or was it seen as something quite liberating that it allowed you share information with lots of people for not too much money, or
Yeah.
was it like teletext?
I'm not sure teletext got the credit it really deserved. God, I miss those long nights, and you just wait for it to come on like it was some sort of weird event.
Oh, it always had jazzy music, didn't it?
Oh yeah,
Jazzy
those were the
music.
days.
And the sports results.
Oh yeah, and the weather. I always remember the weather page because of the little funky sun symbol, which
Yeah.
never. Well, the cloud symbol
Do you
was more often than not.
Do you remember on Channel 4 there was like a quiz game? I think it's called Bamboozle.
Oh, I didn't know Channel 4 had teletext.
Yeah.
And just for our younger members of our audience, this is in the days when TV was analog and you had to have an antenna to get broadcasting, or unless you had a Sky Dish if you were one of those fancy families.
Oh yes, Sky Dish.
Anyway, to answer your question, yes, they were popular.
I like a good paperback. I'd usually choose the paperback over the hardback. They're a bit more convenient. Doesn't matter if you drop them in the bath.
So, also alongside this was an overwhelming massive class divide. Oh, again, another unfortunate parallel. And there was a massive disparity between what the papers and the establishment thought and said and did, and what actual people thought and said and did. And a lot of people were starting to actually notice this, particularly among the more sort of enlightened, sort of upper middle class people. I'm talking your sort of George Orwell types.
Yeah.
In fact, the men we're about to introduce were mates of George Orwell in many ways. They were part of the same sort of communities and collectives who were sharing the sort of same ideas. You know, they were thinkers, they were documentarists, they were anthropologists, they were, the three thinking sort of creative
So they were
fields.
a bit like us, but with class and money and breeding.
They didn't have money. They were from that class who had the breeding and the status, but were always perennially short of cash because they didn't have much of an inheritance.
Oh, okay.
It's one of those weird English class things where you could be, an aristocrat, but absolutely broke.
Oh, right, yeah. Were they a bit Bertie Wooster?
Yes. Anyway, back to mass observation.
Cool. So, as we mentioned, the origins of mass observation can be traced back to the 1930s. And while the world was recorded by newspapers and bureaucrats at the time, it was very rare that normal people were asked for their thoughts and experiences. So, in January 1937, a letter appeared in the pages of the New Statesman, which was signed by three former Cambridge students. They were Tom Harrison, an anthropologist and ornithologist, Humphrey Jennings, who was a painter and a filmmaker, and Charles Madge, who was a poet and also a Daily Mirror journalist. Somehow those things don't really mesh, but maybe it was a different time in the 1930s.
So it's interesting they both have two jobs.
Yeah.
Just can't decide.
They got two jobs and yet they can do this as well. They were obviously very efficient. But while it was not uncommon for letters to be published in the New Statesman, this one was to announce the start of something quite novel, which was a new social research organisation to be called Mass Observation. So anybody who happened to read the 1937 letter may think that this mass observation business all sounded a bit eccentric. Some of the topics which the authors intended to observe included the behaviour of people at war memorials, shouts and gestures of motorists, bathroom behaviour, beards, armpits, eyebrows, anti-Semitism, distribution, diffusion and significance of the dirty joke, and the private lives of midwives. So if only Twitter had existed in 1937, they probably would have had a field day.
They absolutely would. But just rowing back a little bit, it's probably important to just lay a bit of background around the three individuals and actually mention the fact that they'd actually met in the same publication previously by chance. So going back to Charles Madge, he mentioned, he had gone to Cambridge, having grown up on the fringes of the empire. He's actually born in South Africa. And he was actually a vehement imperialist until one day he happened to see the Jarrah marchers marching by his home, and that kind of changed his worldview perspective entirely, and he became a member of the Communist Party. So he lived in a place called Blackheath in London, and he had also gone to Cambridge with Humphrey Jennings, so they knew each other. They knew each other from Cambridge, and they lived in the same area. And they were part of this community in Blackheath that were insanely interested in lots of different things, including surrealist poetry, but also the sort of the plight of the common man and the growing social divide that we mentioned above. And that growing social divide was one of the catalysts for Mass Observation's foundation, particularly the 1936 abdication crisis, so Madge and Humphreys were all sat around chatting with their friends about, we don't really care that Edward's marrying a divorced woman. Is this such a big deal? What do the people think? Because all the papers say, oh, this is a disaster. Everyone hates the king for this. In actuality, Madge, as his role as a Daily Mirror journalist, was actually being asked to go out and interview people who were all giving him the opposite of what the paper wanted to say. They were like saying, we support the king, we love the king.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, it was almost like the media was censoring public opinion. And Mass Observation came about from an initial idea from Humphrey Jennings and Madge, who both wanted to sort of gauge public opinion. And so they drew up a letter which they outlined a London-based project to encourage a national panel of volunteers to regularly sort of reply to them on a variety of matters and questions. And this appeared in the New Statesman. It just happened that on the same page that this appeared, it was like a published letter. Newspapers still have them like letters and comments, don't they?
Yeah.
Harrison had a poem published on the same page. And obviously Harrison had gone to look at his poem.
Yeah.
And saw the other letter. And he was like, well, this is right up my alley. Because as you said, Harrison was this sort of anthropologist. He was actually kind of... I'm trying to think of a good analogy. What was the name of the pirate in Pirates of the Caribbean that Johnny Depp played?
Jack Sparrow.
Yeah, Jack Sparrow. So that's what comes to mind in my head, because he's kind of like this larger-than-life, bit swashbuckling, bit of a sort of layabout aristocrat who sort of just somehow meanders through life.
Yeah, he just seems to sort of dabble in everything as well.
I think it was just par for the course being upper middle class in those days, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be you just do a bit of this and that, and you go, oh yeah, I'm an archaeologist, but sometimes I'm also a poet, and sometimes I'm a photographer, and sometimes I'm a bird watcher, and it was like completely legitimate that you did all of these things.
And of course, Harrison himself was also a Cambridge boy, but he actually dropped out of Cambridge because he basically took to drink and decided it was too much fun to not drink. So he just went around sort of haunting the streets of Oxford.
Strange choice.
Yeah. But despite his sort of flamboyant, swashbuckling lifestyle, it did not prevent him from being invited to a number of expeditions to remote parts of the world, which is where he picked up his experience in anthropology.
Yeah.
So again, to be rich in those days was like, oh, do you want to go halfway around the world, look at some birds? Yeah, why not? Got nothing else to do. And he had actually gone up to Bolton to basically try his hand at human anthropology, particularly working class anthropology. Like he once remarked that he felt he knew more about the savages of Borneo than the savages of northern England, which perhaps shows you some of the prejudices and stereotypes held by the upper middle class. He saw the opportunity to sort of get these guys involved and expand the operation. And so they sort of met up, talked about the idea, and that's led to the letter that you mentioned being published in the New Statesman, declaring the sort of birth of mass observation.
Probably one of the biggest characters when you look into mass observation is probably Harrison, just because he was just kind of, as you said, one of those characters that he just seemed to have a very interesting life and a very kind of unique way of going about things. But if you sort of look back at his life, you see little inklings of sort of what he would become and how he would kind of go about doing things. So when you look at his childhood, he was born in Argentina, but he allegedly had a very lonely childhood. He apparently had no friends other than his brother. His father was a railway engineer in Argentina. His mother had very little interest in her children. So he was left under the charge of the nanny, who would take him out into the country. And this is where he first took an interest in nature and birds. Eventually, he gets sent to England to attend private school. And again, he is very, very lonely. He has a lot of trouble making friends. He's not very interested in socialising or anything. But he is very interested in kind of studying his classmates, and he makes notes of them and he watches them, and he makes particular note of the social hierarchy in the school, how certain boys have sort of more authority than others, and how the kind of it all works together socially. I mean, in itself, it sounds a bit strange. If you had if your school called you and you said your child is studying his classmates and the social hierarchy, you'd probably think there was something wrong with them. But when you look at the rest of Tom Harrison's life, this actually seems like pretty par for the course. He eventually goes back to Argentina, and his father teaches him how to hunt and fly fish and climb, and this just increases his interest in studying nature. And so we mentioned he ends up in Cambridge studying for a degree in natural sciences, which he eventually drops out from because, as you say, he decided that drinking on the streets of Oxford was far more fun. But this eventually leads him to Borneo and the New Hebrides.
I find one of the most interesting things about mass observation is that obviously Madge and Jennings came up with the concept of it, and Harrison is the one that's kind of forever more associated with it because he kind of jumped on board and sort of took it over with his dominant personality.
Yeah, he feels like this real overbearing kind of character. When people speak of him, specifically during his sort of war days, they say that he was not shy of an argument. He was very kind of maybe a little hot-headed.
I mean, Dorothy Sheridan, who would later go on to sort of oversee the mass observation archives and write extensively on of its past and history, described him as sort of an emotional bully and a whimsical petty tyrant. But yeah, so these three men, Harrison, Madge and Jennings, they all sort of came from the same sort of social and political perspective on the world, each differing slightly. I mean, Madge and Jennings were more dreamers and poets, and Harrison was really just interested in finding out about people. So once they published the manifesto, they formed this project titled Worktown around partially some of the work that Harrison was already doing in Bolton. As we mentioned, he was studying covertly.
This is something that he picked up during his time in Borneo, though, wasn't it? When he was working with the tribes, his approach was rather than to observe them from afar, he kind of immersed himself in it. He tried to live as they lived, to live from the land. And to him, that was a more effective way of studying a group of people, to become one of them and study them from within rather than as an outsider. And that's sort of what he carried over to when he moved to Bolton. So he actually takes a job in a local cotton mill and he works 11 hours a day. But it gave him a great opportunity to study his co-workers who were working class northerners. And during this, he notices a discrepancy between what was being talked about around him by the common men and what was being reported in the newspapers. And this is something he would refer to as two different languages of thought. And
that's exactly the kind of observation that Jennings and Madge were having. But they were having those conversations in their upper class circles, and Harrison was actually out on the coalface, so to speak, doing it. And so they came to the conclusion of continuing the work in Bolton. Madge would take charge of creating day surveys and recruiting people, while Jennings was responsible for sort of looking at the results and presenting the results, because he was obviously the filmmaker and the documentary output. So this sort of gave birth to the Worktown project, which has been characterised by some. It was just a bunch of upper class intellectuals sort of just descending on Bolton and then interfering in people's lives, which kind of, I guess, draws parallels to the Narodnik movement in Russia, where a load of socialist left-leaning aristocrats descended into the Russian peasantry and were duly kicked out because they were annoying as hell.
It does feel a little bit like Gorillas in the Mist.
Yeah, but actually it was actually kind of the opposite. I mean, a lot of the people in Bolton kind of knew. I mean, you could spot an aristocrat a mile away, so they kind of knew, oh, hang on, what's going on here? They were quite savvy about it. But they were kind of like, well, they're not doing any harm. They're trying to be in the community. They're buying beers. You know, some people took offence to it, but most of the people were like, who cares? You know, let them do what they want to do. They're the rich people always do. So Harrison recruited a load of friends to get involved, including famous photographer Humphrey Spender, who would take a number of pictures of the Worktown project, which would then not be published for decades and decades after. But they also included many local Aryan class background figures to take part in studying Bolton's people and finding out their attitudes and opinions on things. One name is Walter Hood, who was a northern working man, who later became a distinguished trade unionist. Bill Norton, who was a coal lorry driver, who joined the project to improve his writing because he was a bit lax at it. Ended up becoming a successful writer, and his screenplay won international acclaim. And do you know what that screenplay was?
Was it Chitty Chitty Bang Bang?
No, that was Ian Fleming.
I'm just thinking.
You should know this from Operation Midspeed. Get with the program.
Oh, I should. Was it about a lorry?
It was not about a lorry. No.
Okay.
He wrote the screenplay for Alfie, starring Michael Caine.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh. Don't remember any lorries in that.
It's not a one-dimensional person, Will.
Just assume he loved lorries.
And there are a bunch of other people from the sort of local area, from the trades area, because they wanted a sort of spread. They didn't just want this to be a bunch of middle-class upper people projecting anything. They wanted real opinions gathered by real people as well. So they would go to meetings, religious occasions, sport activities, out on the street. And, of course, one of the most important places was the local pub, where observers would drink pints after pints with locals, noting down the rituals people engaged in, the rate of consumption by other people, the topics of conversation, and they write this all down by nipping off into the loos to write it out of sight. One of the other areas of it's kind of funny was when they went to dance halls and cinemas as well, and apparently one of the unacknowledged perks for being a male observer, because I think there were only a few women observers, one of which was Penelope Barlow, who was the daughter of one of the philanthropists who provided mass observation and financial support.
Yeah.
Anyway, most of them were male, and and they were actually encouraged to pursue young women for scientific reasons, obviously to record their thoughts. So until the first female observers like Penelope made the journey to Bolton, most of the data from women came from snogging sessions.
Right. There are some sort of quite strange comments that come back from some of these observers. One of them involves one who went to a dance hall, and he was observing the couples dancing, and he was making very intricate notes on the dances they were doing and whether they were doing them correctly or not. So, I mean, some of it was like proper anal stuff that they were actually making notes of, but 70, 80 years down the line, it's fascinating just to read these really intricate little bits of detail that otherwise you wouldn't really bother about. But the investigators were based from a property on Davenport Street in Bolton. And from here, they recorded people's behaviour and conversations in as much detail as possible. This was predominantly by keeping diaries or performing open-ended questionnaires, but also just kind of turning up at places and observing people and seeing what they do and what they talk about. So these places, we've mentioned a few, but they included meetings, religious occasions, sporting and leisure activities, just the street, and people's workplaces as well. Harrison was keen to emphasise that it was important not just to listen to what people were doing, but to watch them as well. So there's a certain amount of voyeurism seems to come into it as well.
What makes me think he had some sort of kink for it?
Yeah, as I say, he was a strange man, was Harrison. He eventually went on to be a documentary filmmaker, so there's quite a lot of content of Harrison speaking kind of naturally to the camera, and he comes across as a strange man.
He actually also appeared on Desert Island Discs twice. Yeah,
which I never really bothered about being famous, but I would quite like to be on Desert Island Discs.
He was actually one of the first, I think, because I think it started in 1942 as part of like an armed forces thing to sort of entertain people. He was, because he obviously was doing work for the War Office, but and then also got conscripted himself. I think he was one of the first few to go on.
The project itself was, as we said, run on a slim budget and relied mainly on what the founders had available to them, as well as the odd philanthropic contribution, with the bulk of the work being carried out by unpaid volunteer correspondents.
The working class house they lived in was basically a bug-ridden, bleak hellhole.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's worth giving a bit of backstory to anyone who's not familiar with the town of Bolton, but it's a town up north. It's about 10 miles from Manchester, and it was quite small up until the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, and it had a massive boom in textile manufacturing. So it was like the centre of the cotton industry in Britain perhaps even the world. It was massive at the time. And then gradually over the years, it begins to peter out. I think it peaks about 1929, and it's got 216 cotton mills and 26 bleaching and dyeing works. But once you get to the end of the First World War, it just begins this very kind of steady decline. And we then 20 years later, we get to 1937, and we find a town which is well past its heyday and is kind of a bit like... You see it in sort of British seaside towns that they have that kind of... What is a nice way of saying it?
They have that sort of... I guess the look of a sort of older person with a sort of hollow look in their eyes that's glazed over.
Yeah.
Their life and essence has slowly faded and there's just a shell that's left.
But by the 20th century, Bolton's cotton industry almost entirely gone, as was a lot of the other kind of related industries as well. So 1937, it's still kind of just hanging on, but it's not what it used to be.
So yeah, in this bleak house, he lived with usually 2 or 3 other observers at the time, who worked 16 to 18-hour days for him. Because every morning they'd read the newspapers, he'd issue directives, they'd actually go off to actual jobs as well, where they would collect information.
Like being in a cult.
Back. Yeah, essentially, they were sort of enslaved by his charisma. Returning to Madge and Jennings, so they had obviously successfully set up sort of recruiting people to take part in day surveys. And the first successful iteration of this was the 12-day survey, specifically May the 12th, which was the date of the new king's coronation. So do you remember we talked about how this basically came about because everyone was kind of like suspicious of why the papers were so against Edward and was so fervent that the public was supporting the abdication and disliked the king's new choice of partner, etc., etc.
Yeah,
they set up a panel to sort of deal with that issue directly. It called on people from all parts of the UK to record everything they did when they woke up in the morning to when they went to sleep on the 12th of May, the day of George VI's coronation, who of course was Elizabeth's father. Elizabeth II's father, I should clarify.
Yeah.
Although I'm pretty sure that should be obvious. The resulting diaries provided a wonderful glimpse into the everyday lives of people across Britain, but also completely contradicted the sort of press opinion around the coronation and the royal family and everything, basically. One observer in Nottingham actually wrote, his mother wept and moaned, oh, it should be Edward. It ought to be Edward. Another onlooker was quite taken aback by the Queen having bedhead, and the new king looked too bony. I've gone a bit whole there. Looked too bony, frozen, nervous, and was staring wildly. So
it's just like it's like reading a Twitter feed, isn't it?
It is like reading a Twitter feed.
I remember Charles's coronation not that long ago, and yes, these comments, they were not far off the comments people were making then. But then again, you say, if you read, any of the major newspapers, you go read the Daily Mail, and it would tell you how amazing it all was. But you talk to the typical person on the street, and maybe that says something about my social circle, but I don't think many people really cared.
No, I don't think that's fair. I think people cared about the royal family, and I think at this time, polls were putting the royal family as quite an important, and they still do put the royal family as an important part of what being British is. But what the papers were trying to do was obviously drive Edward out, or they weren't accepting of his preference for a divorced woman.
Or they wanted to stir up a scandal to sell newspapers.
Yeah, possibly. Whereas the actually ordinary public were like, yeah, he can do what he wants, he's the king.
Right.
So yeah, anyway, this collection of diaries led to the highly successful, at least critically successful, May the 12th Mass Observation Day Survey, which came out in book form in 1937. It sold terribly.
Yeah.
Mainly due to its incredible cost. In fact, I think it was like a quarter of a month's wages for a mine worker to buy this book.
Should have got it on Kindle.
They wouldn't have been able to get one because they were a miner. Sorry. So by 1938, observers were growing in number for mass observation, because although the book had been critically a flop, People were still being attracted to it, wanting to get involved in it, and they were being asked their opinions on everything, including political crisis, the preparations for war. All the time, the project in Bolton was still ongoing as well. They were collecting reams and reams of material, which actually fed into some of the published materials they created around this time as well. After the declaration of war in September 1939, they were given a choice between keeping a full diary or just responding to monthly directives. Some of the panel opted to do both, and during the 6 years of war, over 500 individual kept diaries were sent to mass observation. About 3,000 people at one time or another responded to each directive, which is incredible. In fact, as early as 1938, mass observation had collected 1,730 day surveys, with a total of around 2.3 million words.
So, I mean, why do you think the take-up was so good? Obviously, this is, it's asking a bit of people having to sort of sit down and do this and post it to them, or...
I think it was something for people to do, particularly for a lot of people who are growing in sort of literacy and wanting to flex their muscles and just sort of respond as well. To be part of a great experiment, I guess, had a sort of mass appeal. And volunteers were expected to sort of be almost like a subjective camera.
There was a feeling that they were contributing to something that was worthwhile.
Yeah, I mean, they were asked to basically answer all these questions, but they weren't actually told how to do it. They just sort of said, get on with it, do it how you want.
Yeah. Is it a bit like, I don't know if you've ever had this, but the every now and then you get a letter in the post saying you've been selected by the, I forget what they're called, the TV ratings people, and they want to know what you watched.
Oh, the Nielsen ratings?
Something like that. I can't remember. I got selected once for it, but I don't think I did it. And it's like you got to fill in this like report, and it's like, oh, what I watched on TV, and did I like it? And you don't get paid for it, but I think you just do it out of a sort of a feeling that it's your chance maybe to have a little say in the way things are done, even though it's very minor.
And you didn't take yours?
Well, I didn't really watch TV. I mean, it'd be a very short thing, wouldn't it? I didn't watch any of these. I just watched YouTube, but I quite enjoyed that.
It's not the only thing you watch on the internet, I hear.
Well, I do have a Now TV subscription, I must admit.
It wasn't what I was expecting to hear back, but that's good to hear. Back to mass observation. So they were collecting all this data. They were obviously publishing different little articles, different little books. Their second major hit publication was simply called Britain.
Britain. That's
Britain. Britain. I'm just imagining Tom Baker's voice now from the Little Britain intro.
It's like they deliberately wanted to make it hard to Google.
Yep. And it came out in 1939.
Mm-hmm.
And it had used all the sort of directives and diary entries that they'd been receiving over the years since the May the 12th publication. And it contained lots of different opinions on again, so many random topics. But there was a massive focus on the Munich crisis that obviously happened.
Yeah.
Chamberlain returning with his peace in our time sort of spiel. And it sold 100,000 copies in 10 days.
Do we know if there's any kind of censorship involved in the publishing of these books? Were any comments deemed to be, inappropriate or too scandalous that they were removed, or was it quite kind of genuine that it was, what people said? I'm guessing there's got to be a balance there between actually being something that's factual and something that is, useful for purpose, and also something that's not going to get you shut down.
I think it's because it was raw collected opinion. They weren't like writing out rules on how to build a gun or something like that. They were published by mass observation, so there wasn't really one to sort of vet them. So the original May the 12th book was actually edited by Jennings. In fact, it was the only piece he kind of worked on. He actually drops out pretty soon after the release of Britain, because he for a number of reasons, he didn't get on with Harrison.
No.
He had helped write the May the 12th book, and then he had made a small documentary called Spare Time, which was based on the Worktown project. He went to 3 industrial areas in Britain, not just Bolton, but he also went to Tyneside in South Wales, and sort of recorded what ordinary people did in their spare time. And it's a cracking documentary. I recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
He was starting to lose faith in the project, mainly because of Harrison, but also because the directives and the replies he was getting, he saw a sort of, he saw them lacking a connection with what he called the poetry of the collective unconsciousness, which is basically creative wank for I'm bored with this, in my opinion anyway. But he basically was saying that the people responding didn't have poetry in their souls, and he lost interest.
Okay, so he came to the conclusion that most people are actually quite boring.
I think I think he just wanted to move on and make more films, because I think that's more what his passion was. And when the actual original mass observation directive was published in the New Statesman, even though his name was on it, he didn't want his name to be on it, and Harrison put his name on it, and that got him upset.
Yeah.
So I think he was always slightly distant anyway.
I mean, it must have been, a bit frustrating that he sat there having to read about what Barry from Southampton had for his dinner last Tuesday.
Yeah, well, he was the one tasked with presenting the data, so maybe he just thought, I'm not doing this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So yes, obviously Britain was published in 1939, but this was majorly important because it not only obviously sold well, it put them on the map with everyone, including the UK government.
Which was quite good timing, really, because 1939 was also the year that something, say there was a sudden upspike in propaganda, which mass observation fit into quite nicely. At least that's what the government felt at the time. So while they had made attempts early on in the Second World War to produce effective propaganda targeting the people of Britain, the success was a little bit limited. And initially the government message was that people should effectively contribute towards the war effort because that is what they had been told to do. But the data collected by mass observation suggested that this was not having any effect at all, and that, if anything, people were reacting quite badly to it. They kind of resented being told what to do. And this resulted in a rethink, and the government came back, and they eventually came out with these slogans which have become famous, which were essentially requesting cooperation for a mutual good, a common language of one people. So we see the sort of things like dig for victory and stuff. Rather than saying, do it for us, your government, they're saying, doing it for you, the people, and for us as a country so that we can win together. And that was in some way influenced by the data that was collected by mass observation, and also by Harrison himself, who in later years made a point of saying that he actually approached the government and said, look, you're doing this all wrong. That was kind of the early times. I think eventually Harrison and mass observation fell out of favour. They did get some funding from naval intelligence, but by spring of 1942, they'd essentially been cast aside.
Harrison had lots of ideas. It was one of the reasons why people often fell out with him. But he did have a close friend in someone called Mrs. Mary Adams, who was head of Home Intelligence during the war. And what he did with mass observation was supply them with a series of reports on how people were coping with wartime conditions, everything from rationing to evacuations to, air raid shelters, all sorts of things. They wanted to record all the responses to government films that were put out, as you mentioned, all the propaganda that went out, and see if people bought into it. Many of mass observations reports dwell on the prevalence of rumours and gossip, which was part of their attempt to sort of develop a barometer of what the nation was thinking and feeling. And Harrison, by working with Mary Adams, had this in with the government and picked up lots of government work, which caused a problem with Charles Madge, who left in 1940, because he was disturbed by what he called home front espionage, which was now the preservation of mass observation. Whereas Harrison saw it as helping to win the war, Madge was like, well, we're selling out people for the benefit of the government. So Jennings had gone, Madge had gone, it was just Harrison left. And he would go shortly soon because he'd be conscripted in 1942. And then he would drop in and out again throughout and up until the end of the war when he came back from service and when he was out. But overall, during the war, mass observation was collecting all these reports on opinion and morale. One of the most interesting stories that I found was mass observation was tasked into understanding morale in cities that had been bombed. So there were cities like Liverpool, which had been quite heavily bombed, but they weren't as dramatically affected as, say, cities like Portsmouth or Coventry, which had also been quite heavily bombed. And so this is where you got an example of where mass observation, although for all its attempts at being conscientious, of inviting people from different backgrounds to take part and get their opinions, it still the observers, and particularly Harrison, still had their perceptions of people and prejudices that influenced them. So, in fact, Tom Harrison wrote of Liverpool, morale was preserved because they had a hardy northern tradition of endurance.
Right. Oh, this is in line with the sort of old stiff upper lip stuff, isn't it? It's
Yes, but it's specifically related to sort of it's actually regional stereotypes that are sort of playing into this now. Likewise, in assessing the initial response to what happened in Southampton, which also got quite heavily blitzed, a mass observer concluded that the population of Southampton is tough because of its association with the docks and the sea, so therefore they're less affected by the bombing.
right. You can kind of see why he wasn't necessarily accepted by a lot of academics, that these kind of sweeping generalizations that people in Liverpool were hardier because they were from the north, and people from Southampton were more resilient because they were a bunch of burly sailors.
Yeah, but to be fair, people at the time also concluded similar opinion. Like George Orwell concluded that the northerner was gritty, dour and plucky, warm-hearted and democratic, whilst the southerner is snobbish, effeminate and lazy. These are stereotypes that still persist today. Like you imagine, like I know plenty of people who think of northerners as honest, hard-working folk and southerners as lazy grifters.
One sort of little tidbit from the war that I quite liked was about accounts they received of pet owners who were building miniature air raid shelters and tiny gas masks for their pets.
Oh my lord! Their pictures.
I know it's quite adorable, really, but it is sort of offset, however, by another report that said that in London alone, over 400,000 cats and dogs were euthanised in 4 days in September 1939.
There's always two sides to a coin.
I know, that was like... it's like it gives and it takes away. But adorable, tiny air raid shelters and gas masks, that's quite nice.
I wonder what the perception of northern dogs versus southern dogs was. But just coming back to that sort of study of bomb cities, I think it's important to clarify what the actual reason was for the disparity between different cities. Because one of the things MO observers were hard-pressed to explain was why Portsmouth, a city with, again, like Southampton, a strong naval tradition, tough and seaworthy, were suffering from extremely low levels of morale compared to Southampton.
Was it because they lived in Portsmouth?
Hey, there's nothing wrong with Portsmouth, mate. Play up, Pompey. What the observers were failing to see was that in cities like Southampton and Liverpool, although some residential areas had suffered quite heavily, the key amenities, the transport systems, and the local landmarks had kind of survived. Whereas in Portsmouth, the Guildhall was bombed, the train lines were taken out, the local pubs were blitzed. Basically, when you take all the good stuff out and the stuff which has an iconic impact, like your statues, like your famous buildings, think about what happened in America with 9/11.
Yeah,
like that was the Twin Towers were such an iconic part of the New York skyline, and they were just gone. And it had a tremendous impact on morale and paranoia around New York. You take away an important landmark or an important amenity, and it's going to shatter morale. And that's something that this stereotype vision of people blinkered that sort of perception of the data. But also, whilst Mass Observation was producing these reports, they were not without criticism of the government, which is not a smart thing to do if they are also your paymaster. It was mainly thanks to, obviously, Harrison's unique style and working relationship with people. Eventually, the stream of jobs dried up to becoming sort of one-off things, shutting down a massive source of revenue. So far, they'd survived off publications of their research, as we'd mentioned.
Yeah.
But they took to sort of garnering up public opinion and looking into sort of consumer research. And Harrison actually he left in 1942 for the service, and the running of Mass Observation was taken over by a fellow called Bob Wilcock, who was a former observer himself, and he stayed on until the formation of Mass Observation as a limited company in 1949, when they turned mainly into a sort of consumer research sort of arm.
So they essentially just go commercial, do they? And then I think they get bought out by a marketing company, and then they merge into someone else. So the mass observation, at least the original entity known as mass observation, sort of doesn't really exist anymore then.
Yeah, I mean, after the war, volunteers just also stopped sending in diaries.
Yeah.
Apart from one special day around the coronation day of Elizabeth II, there were only a handful of diarists left, which obviously makes the research and the data less valuable, which is why they had to turn to consumer sort of research and other outlets. And of course, Harrison himself finally left in 1945. I mean, not to say that after he went, they weren't producing full publications. Like between the 40s and the 50s, mass observation produced loads of interesting things, including one on birth rate in 1945.
Yeah, they did an interesting study on sexuality in 1949. And while 1940s Britain is often depicted as somewhat suppressed, the data collected actually presented an entirely different image. So some of the more notable points the survey picked up on was just how commonplace adultery was. So actually 1 in 5 participants actually admitted to having actually a homosexual encounter. I mean, adultery is one thing, but homosexuality, you'd have thought that would be unthinkable in the 1940s, at least on that kind of scale, 1 in 5. But one particular account actually refers to a weekend spent in Brighton, which was, like today, a bit of a gay hotspot. And it goes into quite intricate detail about the sort of activities that would make a drag queen blush. So, going back a little bit, 1945, Harrison leaves the project. But that's not really the end of Harrison. He actually goes on to do a lot more interesting things in his life. As we said, during the war, Harrison is conscripted into the army. And he's actually tasked with leading Z Special Unit, which is also known as Z Force, which was a joint Allied Special Forces unit intended to operate behind enemy lines in Japanese-occupied Borneo. So on the 25th of March 1945, Harrison and 7 Australian commandos are parachuted onto a plateau in rural Borneo. Harrison then sets about making contact with the local tribes in an effort to convince them to attack the occupying Japanese soldiers. Harrison drew upon his previous experience and set about culturally immersing himself and his unit into the tribe, much as he had done in Borneo before, and arguably in Bolton in the cotton mills. He was successful. He managed to contact the local tribes, and they effectively took part in this sort of guerrilla warfare in attacking the occupying Japanese. And then when the war eventually ends, Harrison chooses to stay in Borneo, where he gets a job as director of the Sarawak Museum. And also as a government anthropologist. In doing so, he effectively abandons his wife and child in Britain. However, he does meet another woman in Borneo who he would then later marries as his second wife.
Oh, well, that's all right then, isn't it?
That's all right, you know.
Yes, screw the other one.
It is a bit sad. Like, obviously, we didn't really mention that he had a wife and child in Britain, but he did, and they're kind of like, I mean, to Tom Harrison, when you look at his life, they're kind of this kind of ancillary thing. He was clearly kind of an arsehole.
Yes, a deeply narcissistic one.
Yeah. But he was a hard-working arsehole. During his time at the museum, Harrison threw himself into his work. Anyway, so not only did Harrison set about making significant improvements and additions to the museum and its exhibits, but he also involved himself in a bit of local amateur archaeology. He was even commissioned by the then head of programming at BBC Two, David Attenborough, you might have heard of him, to produce a series of documentaries about the local fauna. In 1966, Harrison retired from the museum and moved to the USA, where he took up a research post at Cornell University. When he later returned to Borneo, he was dismayed to be actually denied entry at the border due to allegations of stealing museum artifacts. Not really sure if this is true or not, but that's what it was. And so Borneo, which had been his home for so many years, was now off limits to him. So he decides to return to Europe. He divorces his second wife, and he finds a nice, wealthy baroness to marry him.
Yes, so that was the fate of Harrison. But what happened to Jennings and Madge, the other 2 original founders, who'd obviously departed much earlier? Well, sadly for Hunter Jennings, he didn't meet the happiest end. He was out researching a location for one of his films in 1950 on a Greek island and fell off a cliff and died.
Oh.
So he met with a sadly horrific fate. Charles Madge had a slightly happier ending. You know, he had a long life. He in fact he lived until 1996, becoming actually a professor of sociology at the University of Birmingham in 1950, despite having never actually completed a university degree in it. And he held this position for 20 years. He also continued to publish poetry and write and stuff. He was a keen and avid writer.
Did they know he was unqualified when they hired him?
I'd imagine so, but again, rich aristocrat.
It was
just falls into jobs.
It was a different time.
It was a different time. Is it really a different time? Look at the amount of MPs that we have who just somehow magically are.
No, it was a different class.
It was I don't think it's a different class.
Harrison himself wouldn't fare much better than Jennings. In 1976, he and his third wife actually are killed in a traffic accident in Thailand, where they are travelling in a bus and they collide with a truck.
Well, it's, as much as it was for the founders sadly passing away, it wasn't the end for mass observation, because although it was incorporated into a private company and became a sort of consumer research operation, which then got absorbed into another entity, effectively destroying it entirely, all the material that had been collected over the years, including all the Worktown material, by the way, which we didn't wrap up, that actually some of it did become a book in 1943 called The Pub and the People.
Yeah. Do you want to know what the most interesting thing I thought was about The Pub and the People?
Fire away.
That you could get a pint for 5p.
Oh, those halcyon days.
I've got quite.
What does that equate to in modern day currency?
I don't know, but 5p.
Well, it's not going to be the same, is it, Will?
Interestingly, they noted that the people, at least in that local pub that they were surveying, were drinking about 15 to 20 pints a week, which seems mad these days. I mean, unless you're a student, 15 to 20 pints, that seems like a lot to be just for your typical week. But that figure itself would drop by nearly 2/3 over the next 70 years, though surprisingly, there wasn't a correlating decrease in drunkenness over that period. I mean, take from that what you will. I just thought it was an interesting fact.
Maybe it just speaks to the amount of alcoholism that I've got in my local area, but 15 doesn't sound that much.
15? Maybe it's me. I feel bad if I drink on a weeknight.
So looking at the inflation calculator, 5p for a pint would have cost... So hang on, a pound in 1937 by today's standards is actually £56. So a pound back then is £56, and you do the maths to work out how much 5p of that is.
56. Carry the one. £2.80, which I think is a very reasonable pint.
Yeah, which probably explains why 15 to 20 pints a week were being drunk.
£2.80 a go, yeah, I probably would be drinking 15 to 20 pints a week.
Anyway, so yes, that's what happened to Worktown. But what happened to the mass observation archives is even more interesting, because basically they were kept, and they just basically lay in a basement rotting until the late 60s, when they were discovered, and then brought to the University of Sussex, where they have called their home ever since. Yeah. And in fact, in 1981, the archives restarted. They restarted sending out directives, not diaries, but directives to people, asking us a range of questions about 3 times a year. And you can still actually sign up to be a mass observer today.
Is it still sort of hosted by is it still based in the University of Sussex today then?
Yeah, it's still based in the University of Sussex. I actually went to the University of Sussex to study documentary, weirdly. So there's a nice dovetail thing. And as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, I made a film on mass observation. So I actually got the chance to go into the archives and sort of do some nice slider shots of them all. And it's quite an interesting collection. It's like just a bunch of slightly unassuming boxes, but they're just filled with so much fascinating and interesting data. And I wish we could share more of the stories from it, but it's kind of a very academic resource.
Yeah, I heard one of the big challenges they're actually having is trying to get it all digitized.
It's a very slow process, because it's all handwritten or typewritten, and there's just reams and reams of material. As we said, by 1938 alone, they had over 2.3 million words.
Yeah.
So it's quite a task that'll take a while as well, because it takes time and money to do this, and it's not like a British library where you've got loads of curators running around doing things. It's just a couple of people.
Yeah, I mean the new revived mass observation in 2006 was actually awarded a designated status by the Arts Council England. So it's obviously getting a bit of recognition, at least, as quite a sort of noble cause.
Oh, it's insanely recognised, and it's something that was quite popular of its time. It's still going, as we said, like it's still pumping out directives. And I think it's an important legacy of British social history and an important part of our future as well, to know what people thought and felt about all these important issues of the day. And long may we continue to look at ordinary people's lives.
Are you suggesting we should go home and watch Gogglebox?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Aren't we forgetting something quite important here?
Oh yes, the quiz.
The quiz.
How could I forget that?
That's what
Yes.
That's what I live for these days, the quiz.
Brilliant. All right then, are you ready?
I
Should we crack on?
am ready, yes.
First question.
Okay.
Tom Harrison, as we mentioned, went on Desert Island Discs twice. Once in 1949 and again in December 1972. So, vibing on the Christmas theme. We haven't really mentioned Christmas much this episode, but it's sort of Christmassy.
Yeah.
His favourite track... his favourite track, I guess this is quite apt for an anthropologist, particularly one who likes birds, was English Birds, recorded by Ludwig Koch.
Is that a song, or is that what it sounds like? It's just recording a bird song.
You know what? I didn't check. No. I'm taking it at face value.
Okay.
That it's just recordings of birds.
I think it's like a women's choir.
Well, you can check after.
Yeah.
The book he chose to take was the I Ching.
The I Ching?
Yeah.
Is that something that... Is that an Apple product or something?
It's a Chinese divination manual. So
Okay.
it's like full of wisdom and proverbs and things like that. However, what was the luxury item he chose to take with him?
What, to go with the I Ching and the Book of Bird Song? No, the album of Bird Song.
Actually, just the one track.
Oh, just the one track.
So yeah.
So
Was it an ornate drinks cabinet stocked to the gills with whiskey,
Yeah.
snorkeling equipment, or a gilded golden standing mirror?
Okay, the first two things he's chosen are, I'm going to say, a bit shit. So I'm going to say the last one.
You're going for the gilded golden standing mirror?
Yeah, I don't think he'd go for anything as useful as a cupboard full of whiskey or scuba diving gear.
Well, it's snorkeling gear, so it's basically a snorkel.
Yeah, no, I think he went for the useless one, the third one.
Oh, I'm so sorry. He took with him a snorkel.
Snorkel?
Because
You wouldn't be able to hear the bird song underwater.
Well, that's the thing. He can listen to the bird song on the island and then go for a dip.
He could listen to it in his I Ching.
Question number 2.
Yeah.
As we mentioned, a number of mass observation books were published as Penguin paperbacks, and they are, of course, a staple of the long legacy of English literature.
I love a good Penguin paperback. Yeah.
I'd love a good Penguin chocolate bar as well. Pick up a penguin. So Britain, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, by mass observation, was published in 1939. But what year did Penguin paperbacks as a company start publishing?
Oh, yeah.
Was it A, 1933, which was quite a monumental year, B, 1935, which was the less monumental year, or C, 1938, which is again sort of a monumental year?
I'm going to go down the middle, 1935.
You are correct. 1935.
Nice.
It's July the 30th, to be specific, was the date that Penguin published its very first paperback books, bringing the likes of Ernest Hemingway and, of course, Agatha Christie to the masses. Question number 3. As we know, Humphrey Jennings was a prolific filmmaker and documentary maker before his untimely death. And he made a number of different films for the GPO, which was called the General Post Office at the time. Which, funny enough, the Post Office had a very prolific propaganda film unit, as we learned in our earlier episode about the Royal Mail.
Yeah.
And he was one of the directors they used to hire to make films. Which one of these films was not made by Humphrey Jennings? Was it A, Spare Time, a 50-minute long documentary about the leisure activities of workers in coal, steel and cotton? B, The Story of the Wheel, the history of wheels, roads and vehicles from cavemen to the coming of steam? Or C, Night Mail, the 24-minute film which documents the nightly postal train operated by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway?
Okay, this is going to be incredibly sad, but I've actually seen Night Mail. I think that was done by British Rail, but I'm not sure. I have seen it though. It's black and white, and it's got like a little.
These are all post office films.
Are they? It's got a little
They're
poem
all
that
posted.
the man's reading over the top. It's very, yeah.
Which one was not made by Humphrey Jennings?
Oh, I think The History of Wheels.
I'm afraid you're wrong.
Oh,
It was Night Mail.
was it? The one I've seen.
Was. Yeah, which is actually lauded as one of the best made documentaries ever.
Oh, that's probably why I've seen it.
Yeah.
I just didn't read the credits.
I also realised I also told you about spare time earlier during the podcast, and I just forgot to change the answer.
Oh,
So I'm glad you forgot.
yeah.
Forgot that.
I just zone out sometimes.
But no, he directed Spare Time and The Story of the Wheel,
Oh, good for him.
which are both riveting.
What an
stuff.
IMDb page he must have.
Okay, question 4.
Yeah.
It's another question about our favourite man, Mr. Tom Harrison.
Hmm.
Obviously, he passed away in the 70s, but a biography wasn't written until 2000. But what was its title?
Hmm.
Was it A, an upper-class savage, B, the most offending soul alive, or C, a right Tom, Dick and Harry?
I actually know this one.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, it's B, isn't it? I remember I was reading about Tom Harrison, and I remember it popping up and being like, strange name for a biography.
Finally, question number 5.
Yeah.
Well, you got 2 out of 5. You might actually break your personal best with this answer.
Yes, I intend to.
Mass observation, as we know, was revived and is still currently dishing out directives for people to respond to. However, what was the directive question last issued in autumn of this year? Was it A, about everyday living with multiple long-term health conditions, B, the effects of social media on people's approaches to sexual relations, or C, people's thoughts and feelings on the monarch's first year?
Ooh. I'm gonna say it's been less than a year since Charles was crowned, so I don't think it's C. I think it's A. I think A sounds like quite a useful thing to mass observe.
You are correct. Well done. You've got a personal best. It was everyday living with multiple long-term health conditions. They've also expanded the directives to include comments on the ongoing conflict in Palestine and Israel.
Do they still go to dance halls and watch how people dance?
Sadly, they do not.
Oh,
No. But you can if you want. You can go to a dance hall, just observe.
Could I
And then maybe-
volunteer and be like, well, I want to volunteer, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the club and I'm just going to watch people with a pair of binoculars.
I mean, you might get kicked out of the club if you do that. But to be honest, watching people inside a club with binoculars, you're just not going to see much.
No.
And there we go, another Christmassy episode.
Oh yeah.
However,
I forgot this was our Christmas episode.
It is our Christmas episode, and to make it Christmassy,
Mm.
I think it's probably best to leave you with some thoughts from some diarists from mass observation during the Christmas period.
Okay.
In particular, one most famous lady called Nella Last, who was actually, her story was adapted for TV by the late, great Victoria Wood.
Oh yeah. She did Dinner Ladies, didn't she?
Yeah. But
Yeah.
this is not Dinner Ladies.
Oh, that's a shame.
So Nella Last was a housewife from Barrow-in-Furness.
Yeah.
And she wrote for her Christmas in her diary, I got out all of my Christmas treasures for my little artificial tree for the centre of the table, and I'm going to put a bunch of holly in the corner and put all Jack's Mickey Mouse lights on. To other people, the glittering balls and ornaments would look like rubbish, but I'd not change them for gold and jewels. They are alive with memories that bless and burn.
Right.
And with that heartwarming Christmas snippet from 1942, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Yes. Merry mass observation Christmas to you all.
Oh mon Dieu!